the sky is full of them. It is a little before 8 in the morning on the 16th of April, 1945, in the sea north of Okinawa, and a single American destroyer alone on the far edge of the fleet has just watched its radar screen fill with aircraft, dozens of them, boring straight in. There is no formation of friendly ships around her, no protective screen, only open water and a rising sun, and the planes coming out of it. On her decks, young men run to their guns, and as the first Japanese aircraft peels over and drops into a dive, aimed not to bomb the ship but to crash into her, to become a piloted bomb, every man aboard understands what the next hour is going to be. One small ship, a sky full of men willing to die to sink her, and no way out but to fight it, gun by gun, for as long as the ship and the men can last. Before we go on, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive on every side of this war and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now, back to that morning, and the small ship, alone under the diving planes. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a place of terrible desperation. The islands were falling one by one toward Japan itself, and off Okinawa the American fleet was enormous, and the Japanese Navy was all but gone. What Japan had left to throw at that fleet was the kamikaze, the deliberate crashing of a piloted aircraft into a ship, a weapon of last resort born of a nation that could no longer win but would not stop. And the ships that stood farthest out, alone, to give the fleet warning of these attacks were the destroyers of the radar picket line, small, exposed, and first in the enemy's path. It was, by common agreement among the men who did it, the most dangerous duty in the United States Navy. The destroyer alone on the picket line that morning was the USS Laffey. Her captain was a commander named Julian Becton, and what she and her crew were about to endure and survive, the ship that would not would earn her a name that has followed her ever since. The ship that would not die. Everything in this account is documented as the Recordson, in the Laffey's own action report, in her captain's words, in the Navy's record of that dreadful, magnificent morning. The ship was real, the men were real on both sides. And this is as close to that morning as the record allows. The Laffey was a new ship, a Sumner-class destroyer, fast and heavily gunned, and she had already gunned. She had been on the beaches of Normandy on day, firing off beach oars for the landings, before she was sent to the other side of the world for the last act of the Pacific War. And her crew were mostly young, many of them boys in their teens and early 20s, the ordinary Americans who crewed the ordinary ships that won the war one unglamorous watch at a time. And her captain, Julian Becton, was a professional naval officer who knew his ship and knew his men and would, over the coming hour, ask everything of both. On the 16th of April, the Laffey drew the assignment every destroyer captain quietly dreaded. Radar picket station number 1, the closest station to Japan, the farthest out, the most exposed, the tip of the spear pointed at the enemy's home. Her job was to sit there, alone, and watch her radar and warn the fleet behind her when the kamikazes came, which meant, in practice, that when the kamikazes came, they would come for her first. The men knew it. They had watched other picket destroyers come back shattered, or not come back at all. They took the station anyway, because it was theirs to take, and they waited. The Laffey had already earned her keep. Barely a year old, she had stood off the coast of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, her guns pounding the German defenses above the invasion beaches, part of the greatest amphibious assault in history. Then she had been sent through the Panama Canal and clear across the Pacific to the far edge of the war, to Okinawa, where the last and bloodiest fighting of the naval war was underway. Her crew had seen a great deal by that April morning, but they had not seen anything like what was coming, because nothing in the war was quite like 80 minutes alone under the kamikazes. No amount of experience could truly prepare a young sailor for the sight of a man in a plane deliberately aiming himself at your ship. It is worth stopping before the attack to say clearly who was in those planes, because they deserve better than to be a faceless swarm. They were young Japanese men, many of them younger than the sailors they were diving at. Some of them university students pulled from their studies, some of them boys with only a few hours of flight training. They had been asked by their country to do a thing almost beyond imagining, to fly their aircraft deliberately into an enemy ship and die, on purpose, in the hope of slowing an invasion that everyone by then knew was coming. Many of them wrote letters home the night before to mothers and fathers and sisters, and those letters survive, and they are full of fear and love and a terrible, dutiful resolve. They were not madmen. They were young men caught, like the young men on the ship, in a war that had grown large enough to swallow them all. That they were the enemy does not make them less than that. It is possible and right to stand with the crew of the Laffey with all your heart and still grieve the boys who died trying to sink her. The letters they left behind, documents of the war. In them, boys of most 1921 to Tian write to their poverty 20 and 21, write to the mothers with a tenderness that breaks the heart, apologizing for the grief they are about to cause. Describing the cherry blossom, telling their families not to weep. The cherry blossom was their chosen symbol, the flower that falls at the height of its beauty, and they had been taught to see themselves that way, as petals falling for their country. Some believed it, some were terrified and went anyway. Some, we know from the letters, did not believe in it at all, and flew to their deaths because they could see no way to refuse. Whatever else they were young, and they were afraid, and they were loved. The men of the Laffey would kill many of them that morning, and it was right that they did, and it is also right to remember that each one was a boy who had written home. The attack began, and it did not stop. Over roughly 80 minutes, by something like 22 aircraft, coming in singly and in groups, from every angle, some dropping bombs, most trying to crash into her. Her gunners fired without pause, the whole ship a single hammering instrument of anti-aircraft fire, and they knocked plane after plane out of the sky, some so close that the wreckage sprayed across her decks. But there were too many. A ship has only so many guns and so many arcs of fire, and against a sky that keeps sending more, the arithmetic eventually turns, and the planes began to get through. It is worth pausing on that gunnery, because it was extraordinary. Her 5-inch mounts, her 40mm and 20mm guns, all of it hammered without pause, the whole ship shuddering with the recoil, the deck littered with spent brass, the barrels glowing with the heat of continuous fire. Plane after plane was met head-on and knocked flaming into the sea, some so close that the crews could see the pilot in the cockpit in the last instant before he hit the water. By the end of the morning, the Laffey's guns would be credited with shooting down at least 9 enemy aircraft, a staggering total for a single destroyer, a testament to the training and the raw nerve of men who kept their guns firing while other planes were falling on them out of the sun. She was struck again and again. By the time it was over, 6 kamikaze aircraft and 4 bombs had hit the Laffey. Her stern was a mass of fire. Her rudder was jammed hard over so that she could only steam in a slow circle. Gun mounts were blown apart, compartments were flooded, and dozens of her crew were dead or terribly wounded. By every measure in the manuals, she was finished, the kind of damage that sinks a destroyer, that empties her into the sea. Any reasonable officer would have prepared to abandon her. And here is the thing that made the Laffey. Her crew would not let her go. The rudder was its own disaster. Jammed hard over, it left the Laffey turning in a slow, helpless circle, unable to steer away from anything, presenting first one flank and then the other to the planes, still diving on her. Her whole after end became a furnace, ammunition cooking off in the heat, smoke pouring up so thick that the men on the bow could no longer see the stern. Sailors were trapped back there by fire and by flooding, and still, from every mount that could bear on a target, the guns kept firing because the planes kept coming. And on that morning, a gun that fell silent was a ship that died. They were not entirely alone in the sky. American fighters, Marine corsairs among them, fought overhead throughout the attack, hurling themselves into the swarms of kamikazes to keep them off the ship, and the men on the Laffey's decks watched their own pilots die to protect them. One corsair chased a kamikaze so low and so hard, right down onto the water alongside the destroyer, that it clipped the Laffey's own rigging as it fired. An American pilot risking his aircraft and his life to knock down one more plane before it could strike. The men below never forgot it. In the middle of the worst morning of their lives, other young Americans were up there, dying for them, and some of them did. The fires were fought by men who would not leave them. The guns that could still fire kept firing. Some of them worked by hand when the power failed, crews standing at open mounts as more planes dived at them. The wounded were dragged clear and tended where they lay. Damage control parties went down into flooding, burning spaces to shore up bulkheads and pumps and keep the sea out. And when someone asked Commander Becton whether the time had come to give the order to abandon ship, he gave an answer that his men never forgot. He would never abandon ship, he said, as long as a single gun would still fire. And on the Laffey, guns were still firing. There were countless small acts of courage in those 80 minutes that no citation ever fully captured. Men went into smoke-filled compartments to drag out shipmates trapped by fire and wreckage. Gunners stood at open, unshielded mounts and kept firing at planes diving straight down at them, knowing exactly what was coming and refusing to leave their guns. When a mount lost power, its crew trained and loaded it by hand, muscling the heavy shells into place, refusing to let it fall silent. Wounded men who could still stand went back to their stations. None of it was ordered exactly. It was simply what that crew did, one at a time, in the worst hour any of them would ever know. And it was the sum of all those small refusals to quit that kept the ship alive. And slowly, impossibly, the attack ran out. The planes that were left broke off or were shot down, or were driven away by the American fighters that finally arrived overhead, and the sky over the Laffey emptied, and the guns fell silent, and the crew looked around at what was left of their ship. She was a wreck, burning, listing, her stern nearly gone, unable to steer. But she was floating. She was still floating. 32 of her men had been killed, and more than 70 wounded in 80 minutes, a terrible price paid by a single small crew, and the ship they had refused to abandon was still under them, still alive, because they had simply declined, gun by gun and fire by fire, to let her die. They saved her. Other ships came up to help, and the fires were beaten down, and the Laffey was taken under tow and brought out of the battle, and eventually all the way home for repair. She had absorbed a weight of damage that should have killed her several times over, and she had lived, and the men who had been there, and the Navy that studied what they had done, gave her the name that would define her forever. The ship that would not die. It was not really the ship, of course. Steel does not refuse to die. It was the men on her, the boys at the guns and in the burning spaces, who refused for her and gave her their name. She did not save herself alone at the end. The small support gunboats that had been stationed near the picket, tough little craft with more courage than size, closed in through the smoke to help, taking off wounded and adding their own guns to the defense in the final minutes. When the sky was finally empty, the work of saving the Laffey went on for hours. The fires fought down compartment by compartment. The wounded carried to whatever shelter remained. The dead gathered with what gentleness the exhausted living could manage. Then, unable to steer and barely able to float, she was taken under tow and brought slowly back toward the anchorage, a burned and blackened thing riding low in the water. And behind her the sea closed quietly over, the place where so many young men, hers and theirs, had died in the space of 80 minutes. The Laffey survived the war, and she survived the peace, and unlike almost all of her sisters, she was never scrapped. She is still here. Today she rests as a museum ship, preserved and open, so that people can walk her decks and stand at the guns. Her crew stood out on that morning off Okinawa and try, a little, to imagine 80 minutes under a sky full of diving planes. Her crew scattered into the long, ordinary lives that the men they had saved each other to have, and grew old, and many of them came back to her over the years, old men on the deck of the ship of their youth, remembering the friends who did not grow old with them. Old men. And somewhere in Japan, families remembered other young men, the ones in the planes, who did not come home either. There is a temptation, in telling a story like this, to let the enemy pilots vanish into the smoke, to make them only the danger the heroes overcame. But they had mothers who kept their letters too. The men of the Laffey fought them without hatred and beat them without mercy, because that was the terrible job of that morning, and there is no dishonor to the Laffey's crew in saying that the boys they shot down were also somebody's sons, flying to their deaths for a country they loved. The war asked the worst of all of them, on both sides of that sky. It is the oldest truth of this whole war, and the hardest and the one most worth keeping. 80 minutes, 22 planes, 6 kamikazes, strikes and 4 bombs on one small destroyer standing alone at the far edge of the fleet, and a crew that fought her guns and fires the point where the ship should have died and would not let her go. That is the story, and it is a story to be proud of, without apology. That is the story, and it is a story of a canned crew doing something almost beyond belief, because the men beside them needed them too. They did not do it for glory, they did it for each other, and for the ship, and for the fleet behind them that they were there to protect. So remember the Laffey, and the men who would not abandon her, and be proud of them, because pride is the right response to what they did. But remember too, the quiet at the end of those 80 minutes, when the guns stopped and the smoke drifted, and 32 American families did not yet know their sons were gone, and other families across the sea would soon learn the same. The ship that would not die earned her name in the hands of men who refused to quit, and the price of it, the real weight of it, was paid in young lives on both sides of that morning. Boys at the guns and boys in the planes, all of them somebodies, all of them gone into the same hard sky. That is the whole story. Pride for the men who held, sorrow for all the men who fell, and a small grey ship still floating, still here, that would not die.